Thank you very much. And I don't have a remote mic, so this is going to be interesting because I usually can't hold still. So, oh, bless your heart. Check, check. Oh, all right. So, all right, let's start things off here. So my name is Dave Lewis, and I am here to talk about ransomware from the perspective of not so much the software itself, but why it is a thing, why it is successful. And I'd love to add a little bit of local flavor wherever I go, so I was able to work that in. If anybody can tell me where that picture's from, I'd be very interested to hear it. I don't have a book to give away. I didn't write a book. Maybe one day. I have half of a coloring book that was done. So I've been doing security in one form or another for about 3 decades now, and it has actually been really an amazing experience when I look back at it. For all the times that I freaked out, for all the times that I lost my collective cool, I have really had the benefit of having amazing interactions with communities like your own, giving talks around the world, which when I look back to the earlier part of my career, I never imagined I would get to this point. I remember sitting in my cubicle in a power company, working away in a bank, and never imagined I would be doing stuff like this because I never wanted to stand up in front of people. But I kept seeing things happen in all the environments that I worked in. And security debt is something that I like to talk about, and I will get into that a little bit more in a bit as to why this has actually led me to where I am today. So I like to identify myself as a hacker, but if you do a quick search online, you find out that, well, not everybody likes us very much. And I tend to have a great deal of frustration with the way things are in the world because we find ourselves constantly running from threats, whether it's kinetic warfare, viruses. All of these things really do cause us a great deal of consternation. And I tend to be very laid back because I am Canadian. Sorry. And we really thought for a long time as a country that we were immune to these sort of things. And that was something that I've been working with my compatriots in Canada to dissuade them of this idea, because there have been so many times we've seen government organizations, financial institutions, and things like that being compromised by external attackers. And they're like, oh, well, they don't want anything to do with us. And the really interesting thing about it is attackers will come for anybody at this point. If you have an IP address, you will come up next in the sequence. There was a time where attackers would be going after you because of your political bent, because of what you did for an industry, and so on and so forth. Now it's just a numbers game. When you have tools that can scan the entire internet in 4 hours, or less at this point, it's really a numbers game. And it's really amazing to see how we got here. As we go through time, we see all these different types of malicious software, and the one that really absolutely gets to me is this one here on the left side. In 1989, there was a computer AIDS virus that came out. This was created by, I believe, Dr. Joseph Papp. Did I get the name right? Yes. And he had created this malicious software that he burned onto about 20,000 CDs that he distributed to members of a healthcare conference. The idea here is they go home, install it in their computer, and after 99 times rebooting their computer, this malicious software would take hold. And in order to get the decryption key, you had to send a self-addressed stamped envelope to a post office box in Panama. This was really, quite literally, the first iteration of ransomware. And as we've gone through time, we've seen how that has changed. We have seen banking Trojans that are now focusing on stealing money, obviously. Because in the beginning, I remember Zone H and Aldas and all these various different and attrition, where people say, oh, greets to all my friends. And this is sorry, I have to collect myself. Brian had us out last night. I'm a little bit slow today. All right, I'm back. And so now it has become very much a large industry type thing. And then they have the evolution of things like WannaCry. One thing that really amazed me here is I was actually in a hotel in Tel Aviv the morning this news broke, and I woke up and I looked at the screen and I was like, you got to be kidding me. It was using a vulnerability that was a known issue for 10 years. This was a lingering issue that we had known about for a decade. And then we go, okay, these are real problems. And then as we go through, we see other types of software like Samsung where it was more targeted. The attackers were getting smarter. They weren't just spraying and hoping to get somebody to click on it. They were now targeting folks. Somebody in human resources, somebody in finance, somebody that's not necessarily technically adroit, not technically savvy. The Luddites, the people that just happen to have email for work. Those are the people that they tended to want to go after. And now we have gotten to the point where there's so many data breaches. There are services like this. Troy Hunt runs this site in Australia where you could put in your email address and look to see how many data breaches you've been a part of. I did this for one of my throwaway email addresses, and I think if I lined up all of my free credit monitoring, I'm going to be covered for the next couple decades. It's absolutely staggering that we've gotten to this point. There's a website out there called informationisbeautiful.net. If you ever get a chance to look at it, it's really quite telling. They take various types of data sets and they crunch them down and put them into a digital visualization so that you can, better understand the data. They also do this with data breach information. The crazy thing is they've had to re-architect how they present this data at least twice in the last 6 years because it wouldn't all fit on the screen. And the attackers continue to prey on these sort of things. They now have bespoke malware that you can get. There is ransomware as a service. They have denial of service as a service. These are the things that absolutely blow my mind. I remember seeing this one platform that was by a group called Lizard Squad. And for a little bit of Bitcoin, you could sign in and you could launch a denial of service against whoever you wanted. It was literally just click and go, and when your money was out, then you can go on your way. But it was just absolutely amazing. But now these attacks have really gotten to a much more sophisticated point. The problem here is these attacks don't always happen the way the attackers intend. So in 2020, in September, there was a woman who unfortunately passed away. She was en route to a hospital in Dusseldorf, Germany. And unfortunately, the hospital that she was trying to go to had all of their systems compromised, or the vast majority of their system compromised, to the point where they could no longer admit patients. They had to reroute her ambulance to another hospital 40 plus kilometers away. And unfortunately, she expired in transit. Now, the law enforcement there tried to, bring murder charges, but they couldn't track down who it was. The attackers offered up the decryption key for free because they said, oh, our mistake, we didn't actually mean to go after you. I don't really see how that is a good defense by any stretch of the imagination. Now, how does this happen? Because, like Miko was saying earlier, email. We are conditioned to click on links. We are trained to click on links. And unfortunately, as security practitioners, we do have a bad habit of vilifying the users. I know I've been perfectly guilty of this over the course of my career. I'm feeling better now. But this is just it. We have to find better ways to provide empathy, to really figure out how we can get the message across to our users without making them feel bad about it. Because they'll come after us, the attackers that is, with phishing email links that something as simple as this. Or more often, I get this, is they're coming at you with text messages. My daughter receives about 6 of these a day because whoever had her phone number before she got it basically ducked out on every single debt they ever had. So she constantly gets messages and all the sort. And we screen capture these because they're absolutely fantastic for a historical purpose to go back and look at and say, this is the way it used to be back in, 2020 to 2022. And when we're looking at all this, it's like, okay, great. So maybe my system gets compromised, and what's it going to really mean to me? Well, the numbers are going to continue to pile up. This is from a few years ago. This is a ransomware infection that cost this particular company $260,000 US. And it's amazing when you look at it and say, okay, that wasn't that much at that point in time. Now we're talking about orders of magnitude of millions of dollars. For a lot of us, it's better now because Bitcoin has actually dropped in value. So it's less of a windfall for the attackers. But the attack base, the possible opportunities for the attackers has expanded. When you look at the fact that most of our vehicles that we drive today are computers with wheels, we have to realize that we got to do better at protecting our systems because we're doing this at a faster and faster rate, and security is not necessarily being factored in. Now, there are consistent themes that we have to be aware of when we're dealing with the attackers coming after us. User-focused phishing emails, how they're coming at you, primarily targeting apps that you would use. But as Mika was talking about earlier, we're moving more and more to a browser-based culture, but the browsers are susceptible as well. And these data breaches will keep happening until we start doing a better job. Case in point, we have various different types of reports out there, Verizon, DBIR, and others, where 81% on average, it fluctuates at 1% here and there year over year, of data breaches involve weak credentials, or 70% compromised devices. If I had $1 for every time I saw a data breach notification that had a laptop that was stolen from the trunk of a car, but it's okay, it was password protected. These are the kind of things that keep me up at night, because this is a defined, repeatable behavior. We have to really figure out a way to break that habit. Because when an attacker breaks into your site and steals these credentials, if they're using them against your site and you've been compromised, how do you know that they're the credentials that are not supposed to be there? How do you know that the person coming in is the one that should not be there if they're using legitimate credentials? I've seen many different reports out there say, oh, it's 200 days before a company knows they've been breached. What if it's 24 hours? What if it's an hour? How much damage could they do in that very short space of time? We have to look at better ways to do things. We have to look at strategies that we can employ in order to reduce the risk for our organizations. Zero trust, love it or hate it as a term, I'm not a big fan of the term, really talks to risk reduction, how we can better improve security in our environment, because we're looking at all the things that we should have been doing for the last 30 years. Network zone segmentation, better user management, asset management, all of these things we have to get better at, because if we're not protecting the users, devices, and applications we need in order to keep our business running, the attackers are going to constantly keep coming at you, because they're going to look for new and exciting ways to get in. My previous job, one of the interview questions was, how would I hack that company? I said, simple. I take the CEOs and men out for lunch. They said, what? I said, yes, I would ask for their password. What if they don't give you a password? I have a brick. We have to really look at it from different perspectives, because we can't just say we have a firewall, everything is fine, and move on from there. We have to get inside the mindset of the attacker, because the attacker's coming after you looking for that low-hanging fruit that we have presented them. And we do make mistakes. When I first moved into my first apartment in university, one of the first things I did was I grabbed a pair of scissors and I went running around the apartment. My roommate looks at me, are you out of your mind? I said, well, this is my, rebelling against my parents and all the rest of it. And they said, were they really that bad? I said, no, but I just felt like it was a sense of freedom. And he says, what if you trip? It's like, oh, hadn't really thought that through. And this is really analogous to a lot of the things we do in security, in that it seemed like a good idea at the time, but not so much. For example, we have this wonderful thing where we love to be environmentally friendly. We love to recycle. Unfortunately, as humans, we tend to recycle our passwords. And this is much to our own detriment, because the attackers know this. So when they compromise a site, they will then take those credentials and replay them against other sites to get more access. And the reason that all of this works is because when we're born into this world, we default to trust. Malcolm Gladwell talked about this in his book, Talking to Strangers, where that is how we are born in this world. We are looking for food. We are looking for shelter. We are looking for safety. And unfortunately, most of us never get past that from a security perspective. And we just assume that everything is going to be fine, because we have that innate trust. And that is where we end up with security debt, because we have a trust that our systems are going to be fine. We have a trust that our technology, which has brought us to wonderful places, is going to be okay. But the problem is that's not really the case. Attackers are constantly looking for new and exciting ways to cause us headaches. And for me, the way I define security debt is a technological debt that has manifested as a security issue, either by time or interaction with other systems. And when it does come to fruition, it's absolutely staggering the damage that can be done. Heartbleed is a great example of this. This is about 8 years ago now, but this was a library that was used on every e-commerce site on the planet. And the team that was maintaining this at that time was 1.5 people. Not half a person, but half time. Every company in the world, and nobody was chipping in. That has been remedied, but this is just one example of many. All of these open source libraries that companies are using in order to do their work, they're not necessarily inputting, they're just trusting everything's going to be fine. So we have to make sure we're doing a better job of pitching in. Always got to work in the coffee break. So we got to this point because of our appetite for risk and how we handle risk. We've avoided, accepted, reduced, transferred. The thing that always gets me is we accepted the risk. Have you ever heard of a podcast, Host Unknown? Anybody have heard that one? All right, cool. If you haven't, go look them up. They're actually quite amusing. But they have this one song that they put together about accepting the risk. Because far too often, organizations just, it's okay, we accepted that risk. All right, great. You accepted that risk in 2017. Have you gone back to look at it? It is now 2022. Oh, no, it's okay. We accepted that risk. And these are the things that really keep me up at night because I've lived through this in other organizations. I spent 20 years as a defender before crossing over into the vendor space. And I remember times where we had reports and I presented them to the board and they said, oh, it's okay. We've got a firewall. It's okay. We have antivirus. We're fine. And they really missed the bigger picture as to what the potential impact was, what the risk to the organization was. What is that expectation of loss? Because bad things continue to happen. I have been in many organizations over the years, either by full-time or as a contractor, and the one thing that always gets me is the beige desktop running mission-critical code written by a summer student that is undocumented, and if they pull the plug, the system will fail. This, whenever I do CISO roundtables, and I've been doing them basically on average one a week for the last 2.5 years, whenever I bring this up, they're like, yeah, we got one of those. And it is so pervasive that it's absolutely boggling my mind. As we move over to, cloud-based systems, which have their ups and downs, of course, unfortunately, a lot of times we'll see the lift and shift mentality of taking these systems and go, oh, we'll just put it in the cloud. It's the cloud's problem now. But how do we manage that risk? We need to do a better job of this. And how are you going to quantify it? How are you going to measure it and figure out ways to improve? So one of the things that we do at Cisco is we have a couple of reports that we put out, and one of them is a security outcome study. This is freely available to anybody. It's not a vendor pitch kind of thing, where we actually went out and talked to about 5,500 security companies and got their perspective on how they did things. And a really funny thing was the first time I heard about this report internally, I said, oh, great, a vendor report. We're just going to hear about it from everybody. But no, this was a double blind. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, really? This is interesting. So it was really amazing to go through and have conversations with organizations and seeing how they were handling security. One of the really interesting things that they did was they were able to reduce the risk in their organization by doing regular tech refreshes. Obviously, that's not going to work for every organization because there's a significant cost involved. But there are different ways to approach it is the idea. And when they're looking at these sort of changes, we're looking at how are they vendor-driven or if they're driven internally. Are they reactive, proactive? And we went through all of this data analysis, and it was really amazing to see all these different perspectives. And the one thing that came out over and over again was ease of integration. Because people don't want to do the hard things anymore. They don't want to manage their own mail servers. They don't want to run their own personal websites. I know I've been down that road, and running your own mail server pales in comparison to managing your own split horizon DNS. I'm feeling better now. Another report that we do is called the Trusted Access Report. Now, this is the cover from last year's, but we just had the new report come out 10 days ago. And what we did here is we looked at all of the authentications for Duo security. And we went through there and looked at how they were being handled within organizations around the world. And it was amazing when we did the trending analysis over the last few years. And we saw that there was a noticeable dip from 2020 right through until very recently. And a lot of this really harkens back to companies were doing their best to try and make sure they were keeping the lights on. They shifted very quickly to remote workforces because pandemic. And a lot of companies I spoke to, they made risk-based decisions that are like, okay, we're just going to do this and go with it because we got to keep the lights on. One call center that I dealt with in Southeast Asia, they had only desktops for all of their support team. They literally packaged all the desktops, the monitors, and shipped them home because it was their only option. There was no way they could go out and get laptops for everybody, just going by the local store and get a bunch of laptops. That doesn't scale. Although I've seen that in more DR planning documents than I care to admit. DR planning documents and BCB documents are always, we'll go to the shop and buy a bunch of laptops. If every organization's doing that, that'll burn out real fast. Or the other one, smoking hole scenario, where the crater that used to be your building was hit by a meteor. If a meteor hits your building, there's a high probability that laptops are the last of your concerns. But it's really interesting when you look at it on a country-by-country basis on who has all those laptops and desktops. And if you see here in the top 3, Ireland is in 3rd place, where on average we're looking at about 4 devices per person for people that are doing their authentications. And when you're looking at these sort of things and you're realizing all of these different devices that, yes, there are some things like tablets and that were a closed system, but you also have laptops that you have running Linux, you have running other operating systems that are potentially vulnerable. So it's a very wide footprint where giving opportunities for attackers to cause all sorts of trouble. And then we look at it by industry vertical, and in this particular case, we went by browser diversity. And the browsers, while we're moving more and more to that, in finance, you'll see them keeping a tight leash on that, and they'll have, one browser that they standardize on. But if you move over to education, wow, it's absolutely staggering all the different browser types that they have. Especially when you look at some of the browsers that they're running are deprecated. They have not been patched in a very, very long time. And then you look at it from who's running Java still. And it's really amazing to see how many organizations are still running Java. But not nearly as amazing as this. This report came out on November 1st of this year, and this is from data from the last year. There are companies out there that are still running Flash. Even Adobe killed it. So make sure you're going through your systems, going through your networks, looking, what do you have? What are you protecting in your organization? Do you know what you have? So many times I've had conversations with customers and I say, hell, how many servers of this do you have? How many of this? How many of that? A bunch. That's usually a bit of a red flag for me. And we have to look at better ways of doing authentication to make sure that we are having a more, cohesive message, because passwords are effectively a house key. It does nothing to be sure of who's coming through the front door. You can lock your stuff, you can leave, but if an attacker finds it, a criminal finds your key, they can get in. The lock doesn't care. We have to look at ways that we can say, how do we value work? We have to look at it from a human element perspective. We want to make sure that when we are dealing with security, we are looking at not only the security debt of the systems that we need to patch, the systems we need to maintain, but the people. If we are not taking the time to properly educate the people, we are going to have ourselves a bigger problem. Because the attackers go after the people. Case in point, when I had that interview and they asked me how I would break into the company, I didn't say going after the systems because I knew I'd never get through the front door that way. I went after the human element. But the way we can improve that is using good UX design. If a user can use your software or your systems in a way that is easy for them to understand, you're going to get much further. Because, for example, I've got my 77-year-old mother using multi-factor authentication for her accounts. She used to use the same password for her cat's name on everything. I won't say which cat, but suffice to say that has been dealt with. But that's just one of the examples. We need to look at how we can democratize security and make sure that we are doing a better job. Because just saying, here's this tool written by engineers for engineers and hoping that somebody in finance is going to know how to use it is not doing security. That is causing more problems than it's solving. Because we can patch humans. We can do a better job, and we have to figure out ways that we can teach differently. You want to empower those users. You want to give them a reason to care about security. We're born into this world, we default to trust, but we have to make sure that they understand that not everyone is trustworthy. And for those of you taking pictures, these will be available for slides later, so you can. So you want to make sure that you are being consistent in your message when you are talking to family, when you're talking to employees, when you're talking to coworkers. You want to make sure you have a consistent message and not one of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Yes, never waste a good headline article, but make sure that you're using it in the right way. Don't say, ha, look what happened to them. Say, Okay, that's what happened. Let's look at our system and say, okay, would this happen to us? You want to make sure that you are getting into security awareness and making sure you're going through and having defined repeatable processes. You want to make sure you're building up the users. In one organization I used to work at, one of the things that we did was we had the ability for people to email us and say, we found this particular vulnerability, or this particular software is not up to the latest revision. And they'd send it into our information security team, and we're like, okay, great. We'd send them back an email saying, thank you for pointing this out, and copy their boss. This rapidly became currency because people were using this to help negotiate their raises, to help negotiate their next role within the organization. They saw the value add proposition. It wasn't a case of here's a $10 gift card to the local coffee shop. No, that had real tangible value for them. And all of a sudden, everybody was engaged because they saw that value and they understood that there was something in it for them. And quite selfishly, there was something in it for the organization as well because we got better security. And when you're looking at your security awareness training, don't just rattle something off and hope for the best. You want to make sure that the questions that you have and you're looking at your time periods of violations and things like that, and you're going through this and looking at what it matters to you. One organization I used to work at, somebody came in from the InfoSec department. This was when I was in networks. And they tried to get me fired because of Twitter, of all things. What I had done is I had opened up a browser with Twitter in it, and I had gone off to meetings for the day, and it kept refreshing once every minute. I was told that I would launch the denial of service internally. And I was like, wow. This was also the same person that told me the only ports you ever needed to scan were from 1 to 1024 because nobody actually had registered ports above 1024. So you can imagine the kind of pain and suffering I had to deal with. We have to constantly look at everything in our environment. We will have to make sure that we are looking at things like patch level for operating systems, disk encryption, firewalls, all stuff that should be common sense. But do you know the posture of your devices? We have to make sure that we are going through and iterating through this because passwords are one of the easiest ways for attackers to get in. On average, most organizations have about 1,400 different platforms they're using to authenticate. And the average user has 190 passwords they use. Personally, in my own password manager, I have over 1,000 different sets of credentials. There's no way I could ever remember those. So we have to make sure that we're doing a better job because passwords can be used for credential stuffing. They can be used for reuse, phishing, all these sort of things. It is a dead control. I won't even call it a security control. It is limited value. We want to make sure that we're going through and doing the best we can of updating our operating systems, making sure we have better ways of doing authentication. Are your browsers updated? Are they to current or N-1? Do they align with the security profile and the risk profile of your organization? Are you making teddy bears or centrifuges? You want to make sure that you're going through and having proper DR and BCP testing. You want to make sure you're performing tests to ensure that everything is valid. And you're not doing it to vilify the people in your organization. You're doing it to shore up your defenses. You want to also make sure that when you're doing all of this, that you have good backups. One company I used to work at, we had great backups. We did tape backups. We put them on the truck. We sent them off to a secure location every day. Small problem. I got there. I've been there for about a week. I said, have we tested the backups? What? Oh, they'll just work. Bare metal system. Got in some of the tapes. We found out that we lost one of every 4 tapes we sent over. Don't know whatever became of those. We couldn't restore anything for tape. We had been doing this for years as an organization. We have to make sure we're doing a better job. Look at ways that you can work on the human element within your organization. It may seem odd to say that as a security debt issue, but it is very much so. We have always, as security practitioners, focused on the technology. We have to make sure that we focus on the people. Because without this, we're going to be in a much worse position than we are now. In lieu of the fact that I'm running very short on time here, I want to say thank you very much for everyone being here. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be back here again. Thank you for the hangover, Brian. And if you have any questions, I'd be more than willing to take them for the next 30 seconds. Yes.
I've worked in 2 continents, 6 countries, and it's always the basics.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, the rest of the audience can hear you.
Yeah, it's always the basics. I loved the message. It was brilliant. Oh, sorry. I really like the message. It was the basics. It's the same thing all the time. The question actually I had was more of a Cisco question. So I recently did up. I'm with UCD, and I did up a report, and I was looking at like the amount of threats we're going to have with IP version 7 or version 6 coming out.
Yep.
So we're going from to 2.4 billion to 340 trillion IP addresses, and I found a great statistic. It's more IP addresses than every grain of sand on the earth. Like, how are we going to defend against that?
Well, again, this is why we have to have a proper strategy. We have to look at it from a larger perspective of saying, not just worrying about point solutions, not worrying about, how we're going to extend that, having a clear path to making sure we're securing all those devices. Because if we look throughout Asia, like one of the benefits I have of my job is I get to travel the world and I see different perspectives. Throughout Asia, IPv6 is already a thing. It is all over the place here. In North America, not so much. But just by virtue of the fact they're changing it, it's going to make it easier to deploy things. And yes, when you add in that and IoT and all those various other elements, we're going to have a much larger attack surface. So I don't blame IPv6 for that. I blame the systems for not being patched to current N-1, as opposed to the users. We want to make sure that as vendors, and we're one as well, we have to do a better job of patching. And we do have a huge push internally within our own organization to get ahead of this, because you're right, this will get worse before it gets better.
Just last, really quick one. No, I was thinking about it because the GSMA has recently pushed an IoT law in the UK that kills default passwords, which we did I was in Vodafone for years and years and years. So we finally got rid of the standard 000 as a SIM card password. It took us a long time to do that. But it's those kind of basics that we need to work as an industry, I think, to...
I agree completely, especially like in control systems. We have a lot of organizations out there, vendors that would have default credentials built into their systems, but there was no mechanism or no way to force the users of those systems to change that on initial login. Like programmatically, it's a trivial exercise to have it set a fresh password as soon as it boots up. So there is no good reason why that shouldn't have that initial prompt and make sure that they actually set a proper password as opposed to default credentials. Like there's a group out of Germany called Finilet. I probably got the name butchered there, but they had a default password credential file they used to publish, and it's staggering how many of them still work today. Cool. Well, in lieu of the fact I'm running over here, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Have a great day.